Hello, welcome to episode 16 of the Talk Witchcraft video series, and I'm talking about witchcraft using herbs in your witchcraft practice, so in magical workings and in rituals. We talked about crystals last week, so I thought we could kind of turn this into like a series of different materials that you can use. So I'm going to talk about herbs, why we might use herbs in witchcraft, and the definition, because you know I love definitions, and also some ways that you can use witchcraft in your practice based on how I use them, because that's where I have experience. So we'll get right into it. So we talked a little bit about this last week with the crystals, but we're talking about herbs. So as a reminder, in episode 7, I walked through the steps that I like to take for casting a spell. And I just find it really helpful to have a structure like that I can follow. So if you haven't listened to that episode, I think it's probably it seems like it's the most popular, the most downloaded so far on the Talk Witchcraft podcast. But in that I talk about how step 3 is about the materials. So things like crystals, like we talked about last week, and herbs, like we're talking about today, and how we select these things based on step 1, which is where you determine the purpose of your spell, and step 2, which is where you think about the correspondences that you want to interact with or correspond with. So those are beings or entities or energies that live in the spirit realm, like the 4 elements, any deity that you work with, any thing like that, abstract concepts, the zodiac signs, the planets, they all live in the spirit realm. So when you choose your materials based on those first 2 steps, and we have the tangible materials like the herbs and the crystals, we're talking about herbs today, and you have your intangible materials like color and symbols, and hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about those in future episodes. And when you have these things that are visible and tangible, or you can see or hold them in the physical realm, it gives your mind something to focus on, and that anchors your thoughts in the physical. It brings that mental energy into the physical, it brings the corresponding spirit energy into the physical, and that's the whole point. That's why we want to have these physical representations of that energy. So again, we have these physical representations in the herbs, and that is just anchoring that mental energy, the corresponding spirit energy, into the physical realm, and that begins the manifestation process. So you probably know by now that I really like definitions. I think we have all of these different words for very specific reasons. Why would we have so many different words if they didn't have a specific purpose? So the problems that arise sometimes is when 2 different people use the same word to describe different things, or when 2 different people use different words to describe the same thing. So I just want to go through my personal definition for a couple of words, specifically herb in this case, so that we're all on the same page. You might have different ways to talk about this. You might want to be more precise with your language, because as with crystals, where I use that as an all-encompassing umbrella term for minerals and rocks and crystals, I use the word herb, and many witches do as well, to be an all-encompassing umbrella term for different types of plants as well as different plant parts. Using this one word herb to describe not only trees and shrubs and flowers and herbaceous plants, but also the different parts of the plant, like the bark or the leaves or the fruit and the flowers and the seeds and the roots and the stems. Think that's all the parts. So using this one word herb to encompass all of that, so we don't run out of breath before we finish listing all those things. So I do want to be a little bit of a plant nerd for a little bit, because I don't have very many opportunities to share my botany knowledge. I did my undergrad and it was very heavy in plant stuff, so plant ID and botany and things like that. So I want to just share kind of the botanical level of what these words mean, and then kind of come back to that witchy, herb word. So let's get into the botany usage of these words. An herb is shorthand. The word herb is botanically used as shorthand for herbaceous plant. And an herbaceous plant in this context, in the botanical context, refers to any plant that has leaves and stems and no woody parts. So trees and shrubs are woody, but an herbaceous plant is anything that does not have that woody part. So it could refer to grasses as well. The other part of an herbaceous plant is that it dies down to soil level or just above soil level each growing season, depending on where you live. Places like here, Florida, there's not really a growing season. It's kind of all year round. So it's not quite the same, but generally that's the case. And then there's 3 different types of herbs. Perennial herbs are any plants that grow back year after year from the underground plant body. So the roots remain alive after each growing season, and then a new plant comes up from those roots, like chamomile. An herb can also be biennial, and that's pretty rare. Plants that are biennial are more rare. That means that they take 2 growth cycles before they drop their seeds or create that reproductive flowering part. And so carrot is an example of a biennial, not the cultivated, but like a wild carrot. Also, I think wild onions are. Parsley. So anyway, biennial just means 2 growth seasons. And then annual is 1 growth season. So after each growing cycle, it will create the seeds and those will drop and the new plant will grow from the seeds. So those are all different ways that an herb can be. But again, as I mentioned, an herb would include all of these and also things like trees, which are single-stemmed plants. I mean, you all know what a tree is, but single-stem, woody material, high branching part. So the branches are high above the ground. And then a shrub, which is many stems, woody, and tend to stay lower to the ground. So they don't branch as high up in the sky, in the air. And then again, an herb also covers like the bark of a tree. So cinnamon is the bark of a tree or shrub. Cinnamon comes from a tree, but it's also the bark of shrubs, would be considered an herb in terms of witchcraft. The seeds of a fruit or the actual fruit, the flowering body, so the flower part, like chamomile as an example, or lavender, you use the flowering part. The leaves, which is, when you think of herb in a culinary term, herbs tend to be the leaf part. So like parsley or basil or rosemary or thyme, those are all considered herbs in a culinary sense, and they are the leaves. But also the roots of the plant are considered herbs in witchcraft. So if you use potatoes in something like kitchen witchery, or if you use, let's see, mandrake or ginger, those are all roots part that we are most likely used. And the stems as well are part of the herb thing. And any adaptation. So all plants have stem, root, flower, leaves, but some plants have these adaptations. So a spine on like a cactus, which can be used for protection, because that's what it's used for in the plant. It's an adapted leaf. So the spine is actually the leaf of the cactus. And then things like tubers, like I mentioned before, potatoes, that's an adaptation where the plant is storing energy in there. So potato is a really good example of something to use in an energy spell, because that is the purpose of it in the plant. And that's a really good way to figure out what to use these different plant parts for, is how the plant used it. What was it used for in the plant? And that's how you can incorporate it into your magic as well. So all of those things are incorporated into this umbrella term herb, even though it's not botanically correct necessarily or culinarily correct. But as witches, we can use herbs in many different ways, whether you're cooking with them, so with kitchen witchery, or using them for healing, like with herbalism is a branch of herb magic, using plants for their healing properties. Fragrance with like aromatherapy can be a type of witchcraft, using them for clothing, making, your clothes are out of cotton or wool or things like that. which is not a plant part, so forget I said that. But then also plants are sacred in other ways as well, depending on your culture and your belief system. And then I also want to remind you of the neutrality of magic and how this can be seen in the use of herbs and magic, because we use herbs like, I've mentioned chamomile several times, but things like dandelions and parsley, these are all generally considered like safe. You can eat them, they won't harm your body, they often have some sort of medicinal benefit as well, so there's this positive idea of them in terms of like healing. But also plants like belladonna and henbane are used, and those are considered toxic and could be potentially deadly or at least harmful. But they still have some sort of value in terms of witchcraft. So even if a plant might hurt us, it still is beneficial, and that's just a reminder that magic is neutral. There's no good or bad plants, just as there's no good or bad magic. We can get this magical wisdom from a plant, whether it will harm us or heal us, and as long as we treat them with respect and with care and we learn about them and we don't do anything stupid, then we can, gain that insight. We can learn from the plants in that way. So I have, in my experience, I found that herbalism and using herbs in magic is one of the most hands-on forms of magic. When you think about things like crystals, like last week we talked about crystals, the way that they're used tends to be a little bit more passive. The crystal, you charge it and then it just changes the energy field around you or in your environment just by sitting there. You can carry it around with you and it'll alter your energy field. You can meditate with it, but it's a little bit more passive. The crystal doesn't change its form to use it. But with herbs, you do a lot of transformation with them in the magical working. So you almost always do some sort of transformation, whatever you're doing. So you might be burning the herb, like if you make a wish with a bay leaf, you can write a wish on the bay leaf and then you burn it and that releases the wish. Or when you're doing some sort of smoke cleansing, you'll have a bundle of herbs and you'll burn them. You might bake them or cook them in kitchen witchery. You might dry them, which is a transformation. And then use them dried, crumble them over a candle or something like that. You might cut them as part of the ritual. So you're going to do some sort of transformation pretty much anytime you use herbs. There's probably times where you might not do a transformation, but even when you communicate with the plant spirit while it's still a living plant, you haven't harvested the parts of the plant. It's, you're talking with the plant or you're meditating with the plant, talking to your garden or whatever. You still can observe these changes, these transformations in the plant, even from a day-to-day basis. Like we just planted trees in our backyard and it's really fun to be able to see each day how it changes. And I've been actually taking pictures so that I can create like a slideshow and see how it changes. Hopefully over the course of the year it changes a lot, and I can see it visibly. But even each day you can see as the buds, they appear and then they open and you got these little baby leaves and they slowly grow. You can see that each day. So plants are one of the easiest way to see that life cycle happening because they don't move around like an animal does. And rocks take so long to develop. So, a human can't necessarily see the changes of a rock as it's forming. But because there's so much versatility, there's over 300,000 different species of plants, it can be really overwhelming to begin working with plants. And because there's so much complexity involved in it, that I know that it is sort of overwhelming, which is why when I first started practicing witchcraft, I sort of listed out top 10 purposes of what one might do with their witchcraft practice. So things like banishing and healing and opening, like opening your heart, opening your mind. So all these different purposes. And then I just researched and studied and found different herbs that could fit into each of those categories. I tried to come up with a well-rounded list where I had different herbs that covered different planetary correspondences or zodiac correspondences. And so each one in the list relates to these different spirit entities and these different topic or categories purposes. I'm going to put that on the blog, mumblesandthings.com/blog/016, and you can find show notes as well, so it's sort of like a transcript of what I'm talking about. And then you can look at my list, these top 10 herbs that are pretty well-rounded, and if you don't like it, then that's okay. I'm also including a blank table where you can do your own research and figure out which plants fit into each of those categories, or if you want to change one here and there, or if it helps you to learn to just copy over with the handwriting, you can just, use it as a place to take notes. The next thing that's important to know about herb magic is where to get herbs, because there's a lot of different places, and you want to make sure that you're being ethical and resourceful and sustainable, so you're not harming the planet or any people or yourself when you are looking for herbs. So I think one of the best places to get herbs is to actually grow them yourself. And you don't need like a huge garden or a backyard or anything like that. If you live in an apartment, you can grow herbs too. Lots of herbs do really well in pots. And in fact, I have a book coming out in next month, and in it I share I think there's 10 plants I listed that do really well inside, and I teach you how to create an indoor magical garden. So make sure that you check that out when that comes out. But there's lots of different plants that grow well inside, and you can use them for magic and for cooking. Many of them are good for cooking, so you can do kitchen witchery with them. But this gardening or growing plants inside, this really gives you the freedom to use as much of the plant as you want. You can harvest the whole thing and grow it from seed again if you want to, or you can harvest just a couple leaves when you need them. And so it's really probably the most responsible way. But I do know that it takes time. It takes a lot of energy and effort to grow plants yourself. In some cases, it might take a lot of outdoor space if you want to grow a lot of them, or if you use a lot of plants. So it's not an option for everybody, in which case you can always, harvest plants from outside. When I used to live in Portland, there was rosemary growing everywhere. So I would just, and they were giant bushes, like huge. So I would sometimes harvest from like the city pots and things like that. So if you live in a city, you can usually find some plants to harvest. Sometimes, depending on where you live, you might find something interesting growing. Here I find aloe a lot in the city planters. Nobody tell on me, please. And then you can also go into wild spaces where these plants grow naturally. And then you really do need to be careful though. You have to know the rules of different places when you go into wild areas. Some places it's not allowed to collect. You can't collect herbs or plants or rocks or anything there. So you have to make sure you know those rules. And then you also want to be responsible where you're not taking all of the plants that are there, because then that plant won't have an opportunity to grow back and you'll harm that ecosystem. So usually the rule is 1 out of 10. So if there's 10 leaves, you can take 1 leaf. and there's obviously going to be more than 10 total, but that's what you would do, is you'd take just 1 out of 10. Same thing for flowers. I try to avoid taking flowers in wild areas because that's where the plant reproduces, creates little baby plants. So you don't want to prevent it from spreading its genes, especially if it's annual. If it's a perennial, it grows back from like we talked about before, it grows back from the roots. So it's a little bit more acceptable. And then, but you can, if you need the flowers, then, do what you got to do. And if you need the roots, that's obviously going to take the whole plant, because the roots are what keeps it alive. So even if you harvest off the whole top of the plant, usually it can grow back depending on the type of plant. But if you take the roots, obviously it won't grow back. And so you'll want to be really conscientious of doing that if you need a root of a plant. Like dandelions, it's usually okay because they're considered weeds in most places. I'm sure people would be very happy if you took the taproot of a dandelion out of their yard. But other plants aren't necessarily weeds, so you don't want to take those. Okay, so that's one, is to do this wild harvest or wild crafting. And one thing you can do as well is you can take seeds of the plants that you plan to take and plant them when you take the plant. But you have to be careful with that as well, because seed mixes, they're not always pure, and certain places require a certain level of seed purity. You don't want to be spreading noxious weeds into a wild area, so you have to be very careful with that as well. You don't want to be causing more harm by planting something that's really not supposed to be part of that ecosystem. So it's a lot to know when it comes to wildcrafting. So if you want to do it, make sure you do a ton of research, more than what I've told you here. So make sure you're doing it the right way and not causing more harm. But it is an option. And even when you follow the rules, there's just sometimes when it's not appropriate, like what I talked about before with the rules. But also certain plants lose their magic when they're not harvested very specifically. So things like white sage is a very common example that's coming up a lot. It's considered cultural appropriation to use white sage, especially if it's not harvested appropriately in the correct way, and it actually loses its magic if it's not harvested the right way. So kind of avoid those kinds of plants that are considered sacred to specific people. But something important to remember is that there are so many plants, 300,000, 320,000 different kinds, that there's always a substitute. So if you can't find a specific plant that you want to use, there's always something else that you can use, because remember, what's important is your intention, and these are serving as an anchor for that intention in the physical realm. So you can use a different anchor. You don't have to always have to use the exact same plant. Obviously that depends on your culture as well. There's some times where it has to be a specific plant, but in most cases, in most witchcraft practices, it's usually okay to do some sort of substitute if you can't find a specific plant. So there's that. There's growing the plants. There's harvesting them from the wild, or from the urban landscape, or from your neighbor's yard if they don't mind you getting their dandelions. But you can also buy herbs a lot of times in shops. There's online sources for herbs like mountain rose herbs. I think that's what it's called. Totally just lost it, but mountain rose something herbs, I think. That would make sense. So there's online sources. There's also local stores. I'm sure there's an herbal store near most people, depending on where you live. Most cities have them. You can find a naturopath. They often have herbs that you can purchase from them, or they might need to subscribe or prescribe them to you. You can go to health stores, often have herbs, and metaphysical stores usually have some herb selection. You can sign up for like an herb kit, like a monthly subscription. The one that I have gotten is called Witch's Roots. And each month they send you a different herb and like a pretty image of it, a drawing, and then all these other things that are associated with that. And it really helps you to learn about that specific herb, and they, all sorts of different things that will help you to learn about it, how to use it, really get into the spirit of that herb. So you can find something like that if you're interested in herbs, to get them delivered to you, and you can learn about one at a time. And you can find herbs in your grocery store. So you can use kitchen herbs that you would use for food, for cooking, in other types of witchcraft as well. So you can buy them at the grocery store, especially if you're on a budget. They're often cheaper from the grocery store. It's still important, I believe, to ask questions. If you're in like a metaphysical shop or in a herb shop, they might know a little bit better about where those herbs came from than like the grocery store attendant. They might not know because it was probably just sent in with a shipment. But I think it's still responsible to ask questions about how the herbs were harvested, where they came from, and things like that if you do have that opportunity. So those are all the ways that I could think of how to get herbs. The last thing I wanted to talk about today before we end is how you can actually use herbs in your magical workings, in your rituals and things like that. And so as I've mentioned, there are so many different types of plants that it's just incredibly versatile what you can do with them in terms of magic, but also in all areas of your life. You can wear herbs, you can eat them, you can smoke them, you can do anything basically. So I'm going to be only specifically talking about magical uses, but one could argue that everything you do is a magical purpose. My favorite way, actually, since we're talking about it, I haven't had any tea since we started, and I can feel my throat getting dry. So that's one of my favorite ways to use herbs is drinking tea. Or herbal infusions if it doesn't actually have tea in it. Because tea is technically, if we're being technical, a tea is something that has the tea plant, Camellia sinensis. I think that's how you say it. But if it doesn't have any of the actual tea plant, a green tea, a white tea, or a black tea, then it is an herbal infusion, technically. But this is one of my favorite ways to use herbs for magic because I just like to drink tea all day. So and I think it's really easy. It's one of the easiest ways to incorporate herbs into my daily routine and ritual. So if I buy a blend of tea made by someone else, sometimes there's some companies that are witchy and they sell teas, so they will tell you this is a love blend or this is a protection blend. But if you buy from something like Celestial Seasonings or a local company, like I buy from Plum Deluxe, which is based in Portland, they are like magically inclined, but they don't necessarily list that this is like used for this magical purpose. So I will usually look at their ingredients list, and whatever the first ingredient, that's kind of the focus, because ingredients are listed from majority to least to minority. So whatever is the most in the blend, that's going to be listed first. So I'll focus on that one and look up what the magical properties are, if any, and if I don't know them already. And then I'll see what the other ingredients might contribute, and I'll just write that on the packaging so that next time I'm ready to make a cup of tea or a pot of tea, I'll be able to go through and pick based on flavor and caffeine level, but also based on the magical properties. If I want something that's energizing, or if I want something that's, I don't know, opening or anything like that, I'll have already done that research when I bought it. You can also make your own tea blends. You want to make sure that the herbs that you use in your own tea blends are food safe and prepared for that purpose. Some metaphysical stores don't necessarily have herbs that are prepared for food safety, so you'll want to make sure that they are, or that they come from like a naturopath or a grocery store instead. But if the metaphysical store says they're safe, then you can trust them, I'm sure. And you can harvest your own and dry them as well in whatever way, and you can create whatever magical tea blend you want in that way. So I also like to use herbs, I was going to say tea, but herbs, in baths. And I guess it is sort of a tea that I make for baths, because I'll just steep the herbs in boiling water in a smaller container, fill the bath with water, and then I'll add the infusion after the bath is filled. And while I'm pouring them in, I'll just be thinking about my intention or chanting it or an affirmation or something like that. And then I can just soak all of that in while I'm bathing. Just let the water, as you soak in the water, you can just let yourself soak up that energy, whatever it is, whatever the purpose of those herbs is in this case. And you can make it a little bit more aesthetically pleasing by floating flowers on the surface. You see that on like Instagram and stuff, and it does feel nice to be floating in flowers, or to be soaking in flowers. And if you buy pre-made bath products like a bath ball or bath salts, sometimes, again, there are witchy sources of these things, and they might tell you this bath is good. I don't know why I can't think of any other purposes but protection right now, but this bath is good for protection or love, or I don't know, why can't I think of anything else? Psychic development, intuition, so whatever it is. And so there are witchy sources, but if you buy from a non-witchy source, you can do the same thing as what I was talking about with the tea. Just look up what the ingredients are and what their magical properties are, and write it on the packaging so that when you're ready to take a bath, you know, okay, this is for whatever, love, and this is for self-love or compassion or whatever it is. You can also make oil infusions, or you can purchase these as well, but that's basically an oil that has herbs soaking in it. And this is really easy to make. All you do is you put the herbs in like a jar or a bottle, and then you cover it completely with oil, like an olive oil or any sort of carrier oil that you might use with essential oils, like almond oil or coconut oil. And then you have to make sure that they're completely covered though, because if there's any left out, you have to leave this for quite a while for the oil to infuse completely. And if there's any herbs left out of the oil, they'll start to mold. So you don't want that. So you kind of watch it as you go. And if any herbs float to the surface, just scoop them out or push them back down so that they don't get moldy. And then you can use this infusion for anointing oils, for different tools like candles. You might, rub the oil on the candle and anoint it with that purpose of the herb, the different magical properties. You can, if it's an edible herb, like if you make a tarragon oil or a rosemary oil, you can use it for kitchen witchery, for salads and things like that. So I go into more detail in that book that I mentioned about how to specifically to make this oil infusion. So I hope that you guys will be excited about that and learn about it in there. You can also, if you want to do it right now, you can find information online, of course. So candle magic is another way to use herbs. You can use, basically, like I said before, with the anointing a candle with the oil infused with herbs. You can also just sprinkle the herbs over the candle as it's burning or before it burns. You can make a circle around the candle with rose petals or whatever the purpose is, choosing your plants accordingly. If you make your own candles, you can put the herbs in into the wax before it dries and hardens, and then that infuses the wax with those herbs, basically. But you can also do this, in the wax. Once it started melting after you've lit it, you can put the herbs in the wax and then it's in there. So you can also make herb bundles for smoke cleansing. So you can, I like to make sure that the herbs are just like a little bit dry, because if you don't let them dry a tiny bit before you wrap them up in string, they can mold on the inside, and that's gross, especially since you're going to be burning it. You don't want to burn, you're probably going to breathe in a little bit even if you don't mean to. So you're going to get some like burned mold, which sounds really gross to me and it might be dangerous. So you want to make sure that it's not too wet where it's going to get moldy on the inside. But don't let them dry out so much before you wrap them, because if they're too dry, then they start to be brittle. So I think it just takes a little bit of practice to know exactly where that is, because all plants are different. You might think that you know exactly what to do with rosemary, and then the next time you harvest it, it's like, oh no, I'm completely different. So you kind of have to get a feel for it as you practice with it. But all you have to do is, once they're the right amount of dry, you wrap them tightly together with string, and then you let them dry completely before you light them and use it for smoke cleansing. I also explain this process in my book, so lots to look forward to there. And then you can include herbs in jar spells, so where you have a jar and you put the herbs in it, or spell bags, charm bags, where you carry it around with you, like a talisman or an amulet. You can add them to pillows, so if you maybe want to sleep with a mugwort pillow to help you have more like psychic dreams, or to lucid dream, to help with astral projection and things like that, you can make a mugwort pillow, or a lavender pillow, maybe a chamomile pillow to help you sleep. So all of these different ways. Those are just a few different ways that you can use herbs. Oh, essential oils is another one that I didn't mention. So these are distilled plant oils from the plant. It's usually best to just buy these, because it's such a process and you need all these different tools and materials that it would be just silly to do it yourself when it's so much easier to buy them. But if you want to learn how to do it, I'm sure it's really interesting. But you can buy essential oils and use them in pretty much any of the ways that I've mentioned here, except for eating, because that is it's such a high concentration of the oil that it's not usually good to ingest it, but you can use it on your skin. So essential oils, really high concentration of an herb that you can use in pretty much the same ways that you can use any of these dried or fresh herbs that I've talked about. But witchcraft is creative. Like, that's the main thing about witchcraft, is that it's just all about creativity and coming up with new ways to solve problems. And so you might find that none of these ideas appeal to you, and you would prefer to make makeup out of herbs or something like that, or lotions, or all of those are options as well. Infusing your body products with herbs, or creating makeup with dyes from herbs, or I can't think of any other examples right now, but there's just so many different ways to use them that these are just a few that I like, and you, I'm sure, will be able to come up with tons more that fit into your personal witchcraft practice. So that is all that I have for you today. So thank you for hanging out with me. I'm going to just do a summary of everything we've talked about. We talked about why we use herbs in witchcraft as the anchor for the corresponding spirit energy into the physical realm based on millennia, across time and space, humans relating certain plants to certain deities and certain plants to certain planets and certain plants to certain zodiac energies and all of these different spirit energies. We can anchor it in the physical. And we also learned about different plant parts and how all the different botanical and culinary words can, in witchcraft, be lumped into one umbrella term of herbs. We talked about different ways to use the herbs and how you can incorporate them into your magical practice. I think that's all. So thank you so much, everybody. Thanks for being here, hanging out with me. It's always more fun to be talking to people instead of just to my computer. So I like to be able to interact with you, and I appreciate you showing up. And if you're here on the replay, I love you too. So you can comment and tell me everything that you're thinking about. I'll try to answer your questions too. So I'm gonna head out and do other things with my day, and hopefully you all have a good day. I'll see you later. Bye.